Hey, welcome back to the Fight Death podcast. I'm your host, John, and today we're going to talk about how to talk about abortion and rape with somebody who is pro-abortion. Just as a warning, this is a very long episode, so strap in and let's get started. Okay, so the very first thing that you need to do when somebody asks you, well, what about abortion, is you need to figure out whether or not they are asking in good faith or bad faith. Here's what I mean by that. Often people will bring it up because they've found it's an easy way to win an argument or to find some supposed common ground. But just as often, especially on the internet, people will bring up rape because it's very emotional, it's very visceral, and they'll use it as a club to silence pro-lifers. And they'll use the optics of forcing you into a position where you have to say, no, a rape victim can't get an abortion. They know that this exception doesn't make sense, right? They know this. They're on the blog in this big master post for rape and abortion. There are links to a place called the Pro-Choice Cheat Sheet. And there, the writer says that lives conceived through rape are fundamentally no different than fetuses conceived otherwise. It's funny, here they're lives, but, it's okay that we want to kill them. Anyway, and therefore, she says, a rape exception destroys the, quote, pro-life belief, close quote, of many anti-abortionists. You can also check out an article from Psychology Today noting that there's a contradiction between life begins at conception, which is the pro-life position. Human life that is valuable and worth protecting begins at conception. And yet 59% of pro-lifers support rape exceptions, depending on the data, depending on who you ask. So some people, like this woman writing the pro-choice cheat sheet, they're using rape to try to point up an inconsistency in your position. Or if you turn around and say, and hold consistent to your position and say, no, rape is not a valid exception, they're going to respond, so you don't want rape victims to have access to abortion. You want to further victimize rape victims by forcing them to give birth to their rapist's baby. And they're going to use this as a club to paint you as a bad person. So the reason that we need to work out what kind of person they are, whether they're responding with this because it's what it's a genuinely held belief, or whether they're responding with this because they're going to use it to try to shut you up, is because how they use this determines how we respond. So we're going to ask to figure out whether I'm dealing with somebody who's just asking this in good faith, or whether I'm dealing with somebody who's using rape victims essentially to further the pro-choice position. I ask a couple of questions. I say, before I answer that, if I agree to an exception for rape victims, would you also agree to help eliminate all elective abortions, any abortion that's just chosen, not because the woman was raped, because there's health reasons at play or anything like that, but any abortion for convenience or out of potential, fear of financial, any elective abortions. And they almost always say no. And I ask, why not, as a follow-up. They'll explain why. And then I'll say, now, do you think an exception for rape is consistent with my position as you understand it? That is, do you think that I can be a logically consistent person, believe what I've said I believed, and also think that an exception for rape makes sense? That last question does a lot of work in figuring out whether you're dealing with somebody in good faith or bad faith, because it really helps you figure out how well the other person understands your position, or really what does the other person understand your position to be. When the other person says no, they don't think a rape exception is consistent with your position as you've expressed it, that can be a really strong hint that they're asking in bad faith. Because if they already believe that a rape exception would not be consistent with your position, then asking that question really looks like they're trying to set a trap up for you. But let's say they say yes, okay? Well, then clearly they don't understand your position, right? If I think that a rape exception is consistent with the pro-life position, then I don't understand the pro-life position, which consists of two. It's the biological fact that human organisms begin at conception, or at least let's say it this way. What begins at conception is a unique human organism, nothing else. And then there's the kind of moral fact that it's wrong to kill a human being without just cause, and then the additional consideration that the typical reasons given for abortion are not just causes to kill a human being. That's kind of the pro-life position in a nutshell, right? So if you think that an exception for rape is consistent with that, it's pretty easy to walk through those thought experiments that we did last time and say, well, okay, we can talk about why this wouldn't be consistent with my position. But first, and assuming that our opponent in this conversation is asking this question in good faith, I like to point out that rape is the cause of a very small percentage of abortions. I say, look, this is why we had to go through the data. Even if you take the Guttmacher Institute and you take their numbers and you take the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, these are two very pro-choice, very pro-abortion groups. Guttmacher is essentially the research arm of Planned Parenthood. The ACOG is not pro-life by any stretch of the imagination. If you take those two groups, you take their numbers, and you paint the absolute worst case scenario, we're dealing with 1% to 2% of abortions in this country that are the result of rape. That means that 98 to 99% of abortions are not. So we need, the thing that you disagree with me on isn't that 1% to 2%. Or the big thing, I should say, that you disagree with me on isn't the 1% to 2%, right? It's the 98 to 99% of abortions that I think should be illegal that you don't think should be illegal. We don't have any common ground there, so of course we're not going to agree on these very small percentages. So let's go back and start working on those big cases, and then I don't want to dodge the question, right? Because we don't ever want to look or be intellectually dishonest. We don't want to sidestep questions. But we also don't want to start trying to make a rule about abortion or about anything based on an exception or a potential exception. You don't set the standard based on the outlying data. You set the standard based on the average. And the average abortion in America is very much an elective abortion. So I open with that, and we say, how can we agree on the rare cases until we understand each other on the regular cases? And usually, especially if your interlocutor is asking in good faith, they say, yeah, that makes sense. And you're able to kind of turn back and say, so here's why I believe my position. And you can lay that out for them and kind of help walk them through it and hopefully persuade them of it, or at least give them another example or another crack at understanding. So if they do insist, if they do say, hold on, no, before any of that, I want to know what your answer is to the rape question. Or when it comes up again, the way that I usually walk people through this is those thought experiments that we did last episode with the woman who becomes pregnant, or the child whose father is discovered to be a rapist, or the woman whose child ultimately becomes repulsive to her, whether because the child was conceived in rape or because the child was the product of a failed marriage or whatever. I walk back through those thought experiments and I ask when it would be appropriate to kill the toddler. And then they'll say, well, it's a fetus, it's not a toddler. And you can move back to, okay, you're right. There is a difference, but what are those differences? And you can walk back through the SLED framework. So you're back in that like constant recursive pattern of SLED framework. Okay, now let's talk about trotting out the toddler. But wait, you've come up with a new difference. But look, it falls into one of the categories of the SLED framework. And it's this kind of recursive process that can be persuasive because you're knocking objections down as they bring them up. Another really powerful point to make here, I think, is to say, well, look, if you can't punish a rapist with death in the United States, even if there has been a trial, why is it that we can punish that rapist's child in the mother's womb with death without a trial? Even the result of a jury trial, no state in the United States under the Eighth Amendment is permitted to sentence a rapist to death because of a principle called proportionality. The punishment doesn't fit the crime, according to the Supreme Court. Even there's a really horrible case out of Louisiana called Kennedy versus Louisiana, and the man in question, Mr. Kennedy, the defendant, did some absolutely horrible things to a child. I'm not going to go into it, and I would caution you not to go look that case up unless you're ready to read some really gruesome things, because Mr. Kennedy, if anybody deserved the death penalty for rape, it was Mr. Kennedy. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't, even in the case of an adult raping a child, brutally raping a child, you're not permitted to sentence that adult to death. So why then? Why are we allowed to sentence this child to death? And they're going to say, oh, it's not a child. It's not. And so you get back to that key difference between pro-aborts and pro-life people, which is what is growing inside of the woman's womb. And so that's what you do with a good faith, a person who's asking in good faith. When somebody is asking in bad faith, you don't do that. When somebody's asking in bad faith, just don't play along. They're using the violence and trauma of somebody's rape to try to corner you. And you absolutely should not let them, because that's just horrible what they're doing. Now, I want to emphasize that I always start, especially with an in-person conversation, I always start with the assumption that we're going to remain civil through the whole thing. But at this point, I think that pro-lifers should be willing to lay civility aside, because what this person is doing is absolutely not civil. And honestly, I think that once you find out that somebody is not just pro-choice in the kind of squishy American way, but actually pro-abortion, which is a lot more people than you might realize, I think that you could lay civility down, because what they're defending is not a civil thing. It's barbaric. It's a disgusting practice, ripping the arms and legs off of children, or poisoning children in the womb, or any of the methods of abortion that you want to name. What they're doing is not civil. So I don't know that we need to remain civil at all times with all pro-aborts. Now, people hear that and they get it. They're a little worried because they've heard their whole life that they're supposed to be nice, and other people are watching me. What are they going to think? I got to tell you, I would lose respect for somebody who let the other person in a conversation exploit rape victims in order to gain a rhetorical upper hand. I would lose respect for a person who didn't come to the defense of rape victims in that situation. I don't know how much ground the pro-life movement has lost as a result of this, but I can guarantee that we have lost ground as a result of this. Because when we are civil with people who make bad faith arguments for abortion, we allow them to victimize not only children in a horrific way, but in this case, rape victims. We allow them to use the trauma and abuse that a rape victim has suffered in order to further traumatize and abuse other people. And to use that in that way, and to use these uncivil arguments, to allow people to use those uncivil arguments means that we, as pro-lifers, are empowering those arguments. So civility, I like to say civility is normative, but it's not inviolable. It's the norm. It's expected, but it lay it down at a moment's notice if you find somebody is making these kinds of arguments with you. And let me give you a good illustration. So I found myself not too long ago at my school as the only pro-lifer in a room with about 4 other people. And there was a guy who came in, that myself and a young lady had started up a conversation about abortion. And another guy joined us. And then another guy joined us. And then finally, the antagonist of the story, if you will, he walked in. And so he said, his opening line was, I don't want to be responsible for a child simply because he put this very graphically, but because I had sex with a woman and did the thing that happens at the end of sex. So later, when we're talking, he brought up rape, and he said, well, John, I think it's real gross that you would deny a woman who has been raped an abortion just because you think that it's wrong, that you would make her suffer, that you would further victimize her. And so I went through the questions. I said, would you work with me to eliminate elective abortions if I agreed? He said no. I said, why not? He said, well, I want responsibility-free sex. I think that everybody's entitled to that. I don't think that, yada, yada. And he also said he thought, when I asked him, would a rape exception be consistent with my position? He said, no, I think that would be inconsistent with your position. And so based on that, and based on, I know this guy. I know this guy's he's kind of an operative. He works, anyway, based on several other factors, but based on that conversation and how things were going, I think that he was trying to put me on the horns of a dilemma, which is what this question really does. It says either give an inconsistent answer and abandon your position, or continue to be quote unquote callous in front of a sympathetic audience made up of other people who support abortion. And so, the bad part's not that he knows my position or even that he's trying for a gotcha moment. We all, when we're having a conversation like this, we try for these kind of big gotcha moments, right? But the thing that really disgusts me about this argument when people use it when in bad faith is that they are exploiting rape victims and the trauma of rape victims in order to justify elective abortions for convenience. And he in particular was trying to use women for his personal pleasure with no responsibility to them or any potential offspring of his union, right? He was using this rare and horrible kind of abortion that results from this terrible trauma that these women, this terrible crime that these men are perpetrating against these women, in order to justify the kind of abortions that he wanted, which was just like, we messed up, go on down to the clinic and take a pill, and that'll solve my problem. So, knowing that he was not arguing in good faith, if I play nice in this situation, number one, it puts me in a losing position. He's framed me as either callous or inconsistent, and I've put that on the table explicitly by asking, do you think this is consistent with my position? So people know if I say, yes, there should be exceptions for rape, everybody who's watching says, you're not consistent, you're a hypocrite. Likewise, if I say, no, there should be no exceptions for rape, he's going to turn around and say, that's horrible, you're callous and indifferent to these women suffering, that's terrible. So instead of kind of passively sitting there and taking this, you need to expose this strategy and attack it, right? And so when I'm talking to this pro-choicer, what I did was I pointed out, look, you've already told us that the reason that you're interested in abortion remaining legal is for your own benefit. You want to have sex with anybody you want without any sort of responsibility. You are not interested in supporting women. You're interested in getting laid. And I said, that is very intellectually dishonest. Now, if I exploited rape victims in order to get laid, what would you call me? And that really shifted you could feel the tension in the room shift, because I went from being on the defensive to pointing out this very dishonest use of women and women's trauma by a man, which is not what, that's clearly not what anybody wants to do or wants to support. And so other people ended up calling him on his nonsense. And he actually, that was it. That was it from him. We continued to have a conversation. I don't know that anybody else left pro-life, but they certainly were able to have a conversation with me. And then when we got to the rape question, from people who were being intellectually honest about it and saying, well, hold on, I think it is consistent with your position, or I don't think it's consistent with your position, but it still feels wrong, then we were able to have a productive conversation, and everybody else walked away from there. We all walked away from there with mutual respect. Now, that guy did not like it, but by sacrificing, his feelings, I was able to come away from that conversation with the respect of everybody else, because I wasn't willing to let somebody else exploit women. I was willing to say, look, these are really hard things to do, and I'm not willing to let you flippantly use the trauma that women have undergone in order to, just get laid without consequences. Another really common example of people who are bad faith actors here is when they use I consider it a slur. If you call somebody a rape baby, that's the slur that they use. They'll say, oh, these rape babies. So these people ostensibly want to protect rape victims, but they use a slur that continues to stigmatize both children who are conceived in rape, not like only 50% of women, at the high end of the numbers that we know, only 50% of women who become pregnant from a rape choose abortion as a result. So that means that 50% of women do not choose abortion as a result, right? I'm kind of holding your hand through the numbers here. But that means that there are plenty of people in this world right now who were conceived in rape. And I doubt very much that these people would stand face to face with them and say, oh yeah, you're a rape baby. I know people who were conceived in rape. I would never stand face to face with them and call them a rape baby, mostly because they're much more than the circumstances surrounding their conception, right? But these people who use this slur, they want to protect rape victims. And then they continue to use a slur that stigmatizes people who were conceived in rape and the women who keep them. If you choose to keep a child who was conceived in rape, you now have a rape baby. That's attaching. You see how that's tying the sins of the father to the child, and then to the mother, further stigmatizing her decision to keep the child. Of course, they'll insist that you don't use any sort of emotionally manipulative language. Like, you can't call a fetus in utero, you can't call that a baby. It's not a baby, it's a fetus. Until it's useful for them to stigmatize that child's existence and say, oh, it's a rape baby, right? So there's another example of a time where you would say, look, you're not being intellectually honest here. You're using these emotive terms, and you're taking umbrage with me using emotive terms, and you want to protect women who have been raped, but then you're going to stigmatize children who are the result of rape, and you're going to stigmatize women who choose to keep those children who are the result of rape. So in all of this, a mindset that you want to learn to cultivate is the mindset of judo. Judo is a martial art that focuses on not on like being the strongest person in the room, but when the strongest person in the room swings at you, using all of that energy, all of your opponent's energy and momentum to put him flat on the floor. So it's not about being able to punch harder. It's about being able to use your opponent's heaviest, strongest punch against them. And that's really what this is. This is just a form of verbal judo. The optics of putting you in this position where you have to say either, oh, I'm going to take this position that's inconsistent with, what I've been arguing for this whole time as a pro-lifer, or I'm going to choose to be perceived as callous and this uncaring monster who wants to victimize women. That's your opponent's strength. But if their footing is dishonest, right, and they're using this in order to attack you, then it's very easy to push them over and to push them off balance. There's a proverb that says the man who digs a pit will fall into it, right? But if he's dug that pit for you, ram into him and push him right in. No hesitation, because people can see, people will see that you are not willing to let somebody victimize women or victimize children or stigmatize rape further. And they will respect that more than they will respect you turning over and saying, well, yeah, I guess I'm just a big bad guy. Yeah. Or trying to direct the conversation away from that. Hit it head on. So I know that this has been a very long episode. This has been almost 3 times as long as a normal episode. So thank you very much for listening. I probably could have split this up. But I'm going to try this long form and see how people respond and see what the engagement is. Tell me what you think. Hit me up with an email. Send your emails to John, JOHN, at fightdeathpodcast.com. And if you're on iTunes, or on the podcast app, the Apple Podcast app, you can subscribe. And I would really appreciate it if you left a rating and a review on there. It helps me to understand who my audience is, to get this in front of more listeners. You can also subscribe on Spotify, Stitcher, Google, pretty much anywhere you can download a podcast. You can even listen on YouTube if you're the kind of person who listens to podcasts on YouTube. No judgment. Subscribe, share, that kind of thing. Hey, send this episode to somebody who you think might need it. And again, thank you so much. Check out fightdeathpodcast.com for more resources. That's fightdeathpodcast.com. Thank you for listening.